A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Vertrauten Schabbat, es ist getan.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be Katnusas.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Welcome, everyone, to Jewish History Soundbites. This is Yehuda Geberer with another episode of Jewish History Soundbites, and this is the second installment in our ongoing series entitled Sisters of the Revolution, about changes and challenges facing Jewish women in modern times and the history of traditional Jewish education for women. And it is sponsored in memory of Yehuda Yosef ben David. And of course, I'll take this opportunity to mention that you can be in touch with me about future sponsorships in this series or in any other episode. And of course, for lectures, virtual tours, and online lectures, and live, of course, when the opportunity arises, and the like. Before I get into the topic, I just want to mention feedback, not particularly about this subject, but someone just sent me last night and just seemed interesting to share. Someone sent me a video, a short little clip of Reb Nata Greenblatt, may he live and be well, talking about his Rebbe, Reb Moshe Feinstein, and him, that in the early 1940s, several years after Reb Moshe had arrived in the United States from Russia, he had considered taking a position as a Rosh Yeshiva in the Lubavitch Yeshiva, in that the Rayatz, the previous Rebbe, had established in his rebuilding the Lubavitch community in Brooklyn. And the interesting thing is that Reb Moshe was acquainted with Lubavitch as a rabbi in Russia. If you were a rabbi in Russia, then you knew Lubavitch, especially if you were under the communists, and pretty much in the 1920s and 30s, that was who there was. So he definitely had an affiliation, not a personal religious affiliation, a connection, an acquaintance with Lubavitch from his days in Russia, and presumably it was also financial considerations. He had a family and they were living in New York, and MTJ was not the wealthiest institution at the time, and presumably Lubavitch was offering him a much better salary than MTJ was in the 1940s. So just a fascinating what if of history had Reb Moshe Feinstein become the leading Rosh Yeshiva in Lubavitch. Interesting story. So I guess I'll post it on Twitter and on Jewish History Sound by social media, on WhatsApp, so you can check out that story as well. I want to get to the part 2 of our installment here, Sisters of the Revolution. We're going to discuss Jewish education for women over modern Jewish history. I mentioned in part 1, just at the outset, I mentioned a few of the sources I use. There's obviously many more sources, and if there's a particular one that you're curious about, you can contact me. But I happen to mention that one of the fantastic sources is a book written recently by Dr. Naomi Seidman about the Sharish Nir and the Beis Yaakov movement, which we're going to discuss in depth further on in this series. And I thought I made it clear that I made use of her book as a source. It seemed from the feedback that I got that it wasn't so clear, and I was not trying to hide the fact that I was using it as a source. So here I am saying it again, and just to clear that up. Last time we discussed the challenges facing the Jewish people in general in the modern era, and the changing times, and Jewish women in particular, with the advent of all these, changes that we discussed in the previous episode. The new exposure, which lessened the commitment to traditional Jewish life of many of them. There are also many social challenges specifically facing women, problems that were so severe and that were so uncomfortable to talk about that many in the Jewish community at the time did not want to discuss it openly, and neither will we on this podcast. Suffice it to say that Jewish women in many ways were facing a crisis at many levels at the turn of the century, and therefore in this coming installment we'll discuss some of the pioneering solutions in the realm of education that were supposed to solve many of the issues facing Jewish women at that time. So there's the overall context is the idea that there was no formal education for girls in the Jewish world, in the traditional Jewish world, until the modern era. And there's this myth that I guess many of us grew up with, that the reason it was so is that the Jewish girls were educated at home. They were educated by their parents. It's a myth as far as the use of the word educated is. If you want to say they absorbed some sort of atmosphere of Jewish life or culture of Jewish life from their home, from their parents, that's probably correct. That's not a myth. If it would say educated, it was not educated by any definition of the word. They had a very, very basic knowledge. It was more a cultural atmosphere. They're mostly illiterate. They did not know how to read or use the Hebrew language of davening, of Sfarim, of anything, or to write. They weren't actually taught anything, especially not in any systematic form. At best, they could read a little Yiddish, and there were some books that were popular at the time that were used by women, but there was never really any investment in their education. In that sense. The first attempt at educating Jewish women in a traditional sense comes from none other than Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch in Frankfurt. And he's probably the first. And before he's 30 years old, when he's about 29 years old, he publishes his monumental work. First he publishes the 19 letters, which was written after the Horeb, but he wrote it as the Horeb. He writes the Horeb first, and then because his non-Jewish publisher feels that it's not going to sell very well, so he suggests that he write an introduction and try to use that as a marketing ploy. So he wrote the 19 letters and then published that, and then published the Horeb. And so the reason why we have the 19 letters today is because of a non-Jewish German publisher. And in the Horeb, which he writes when he's 29. When he finishes writing when he's 29 years old, a young rabbi, he dedicates, on the title page, he dedicates it to the young thinking Jewish men and women, which is a novelty at the time, that he's writing this rather sophisticated book for young Jewish men and women. There had been books, Sfarim, written for women, mainly Musar, and stories, Midrashim, Hasidic stories also, even though they were specifically targeting women, mainly in Yiddish. As I said, most women were illiterate as far as Hebrew was concerned. In fact, Shmuel Abba Horodetsky wrote, I think I mentioned this at least one other time in another episode, when he was writing about the Hasidic movement, he felt that the Hasidic movement, in his rather skewed view of things, he felt the Hasidic movement opened new opportunity for the Jewish woman, and he listed a whole bunch of reasons for it, and one of them was that there was literature written for women. That wasn't exactly written for them, but there was the certain access that they had. Chafetz Chaim, who I'm going to speak about soon, himself wrote 2 Sfarim specifically geared towards women, and he also addressed a female crowd in the great synagogue in Vilna. He spoke to them about Tyrus HaMishpacha. I think I mentioned that in one of the episodes about the Chafetz Chaim a while back. But here in Horeb, the Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, he went on to describe his educational philosophy. And he emphasizes that the curriculum of his educational philosophy is for girls as well as boys, and with some minor modifications. And this included formal education in Torah subjects for girls. That was his plan. Not only was it his plan, but he actually implemented it as his plan when he eventually opened his Realschule, his school in Frankfurt. Now, when he published the Chorov, it's 80 years before Beis Yaakov opens. And then in 1853, which is less than 20 years later, 15 years later, again, many, many decades before Jewish education is available for girls in Eastern Europe, so his Realschule opens up for boys and girls. 83 students were boys and girls, and they learn Torah subjects, and they learn the same subjects as the boys, aside from two. Which two? Gemara. The girls in the Realschule did not study Gemara, and math. So Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch felt that math was not for girls either. Go figure. So Gemara and math is only for boys. I don't know if the girls complained too much about not having the math. I definitely would not have complained if I did not have to do math. And he explained that we need to connect them to their spiritual sources. Again, it was seemingly a justification due to modern times, but though he does seem to make it sound that it was a preferred method, even not as a result of the modern era, which is a debate in general about the philosophy of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, which I'm not going to get into right now. He wrote in a letter that the goal is to have them, the girls, our daughters, he calls them, prefer on their own, and I quote, who should they prefer on their own? I'm quoting, Yeshaya, Hanavi, and Amos, prefer them to Goethe and Shakespeare. If you wish to provide for your future, do not forget your daughters, end quote. So he wants the goal is that they should prefer Yeshaya and Amos to, those are Nevi'im, by the way, for any of the male listeners, and to prefer to Goethe and Shakespeare. So the idea is that there should be an organized institutional Orthodox education for girls, and it begins in Frankfurt in the 1850s by Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. It's on the map. It exists. And therefore, in the resulting decades and afterwards, the Frankfurt women were very learned, very knowledgeable in Jewish subjects. They're also very pious, very religious, and generations of women, elderly, young, even girls, and middle-aged women went to shul every Shabbos in Frankfurt, and they would daven from a Cheder. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch also opened a high school for girls. It was one of the four institutions. As part of the Realschule, he had the Realschule, the elementary school, and then he had a high school for girls. He had a yeshiva, which he opened also for older boys, and then he also had a school that he opened for the Ostjuden, who didn't quite, the Eastern European Jews who were coming to Frankfurt, who didn't quite fit into any of his other institutions. So it did pop up in other places in Germany in the ensuing decades. So it did have an influence, and it was to have an influence later on Beis Yaakov as well. Now, of course, throughout the generations, there are individual girls who get an education. It's not institutionalized. There's the wealthy families hire private tutors for their daughters to have them taught. And they're taught Jewish subjects and halacha and chumash and tanakh and all kinds of things. Sometimes if there's super intelligent girls or daughters of rabbis, daughters of Talmudical scholars, they also ended up being learned, scholarly, or knowledgeable girls, daughters. And some of them became legendary, and some of them became famous Rebbitzins afterwards. The Rebbitzin of Netziv is one famous example. But their story, all these stories throughout history, their story of getting an education and becoming knowledgeable in Jewish subjects and Torah subjects was obviously the exception, which proved the rule that overall there was no institutionalized framework or infrastructure that provided that education for the overall female Jewish population in the traditional Jewish community. In addition to that, there was, and you have to mention this as well, at different points in history, and it's possibly even as early as the 16th and 17th centuries, hundreds of years before that, in the Polish kingdom, the Polish Commonwealth, there was what seems to be called in the sources that I saw, cheders for girls. In fact, I used to doubt, it just sounded funny to even call it a cheder for girls. And I once actually heard it live in an interview I conducted for a Holocaust survivor about a year ago. I asked her where she went to school, and she mentioned that she went to the local public school like everyone else. But she also attended, I think it was either in the summers or in the afternoons or both, I don't remember exactly the details. She attended a cheder for girls in her shtetl in Galicia. So it existed down to modern times. And in these cheder for girls, there was some sort of framework. They studied some subjects, some Torah subjects. The concept existed for a while. It was not institutionalized. It was not that common. It was not that widespread. Not very many Jewish girls attended these, but it existed. The idea exists. Now, of course, there's also a halachic status and a dispute about that halachic status, which, of course, I'm not going to get into. And you can ask people knowledgeable in Torah subjects, which I'm not, and people who know halacha, which I'm not. And there's a whole dispute about whether it's permissible. It just comes into the historical context because that was one of the reasons that didn't exist until that point. And that's also plays a role in history in modern times because of the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim, who wrote tons and loads of Sfarim, and perhaps we can discuss his many writings at another opportunity, but one of them was a sefer called Likutei Halachas. And in the Likutei Halachas on the Masechta of Saita, which was published in 1911. Again, 1911 is about 6 years before any Beis Yaakov opened, before there's any formal Jewish education. And in there, he gives what's now become to be known as his famous heter. His permits teaching Torah to girls. Why? Because of the changing times. Does that mean that the Chafetz Chaim was reformed because the times changed, so the halacha changes? No, that does not mean that. And we have anyone who knows a little bit about the Chafetz Chaim knows how very much conservative he was, and not conservative as opposed to reform, but conservative in his views, and definitely was not coming to become a liberal or a feminist. The idea was that first of all, let's give the context. It's written as a footnote. It's not. He didn't put it out as a public proclamation. He didn't give it as a speech. It was a footnote in a Sefer Halacha on a Masechta in Shas, in a scholarly work, and really it was more about the state of Torah and Torah study and Yiddishkeit and traditional Jewish life during the changing times than it was about women. In fact, in a different Sefer, he even blamed the women for being part of the problems of the modern times. He blamed them for pursuing a luxurious lifestyle, and because of that, their husbands had to work harder and make more money because they wanted all kinds of luxuries. That's what he writes. And he also even blames women for the terrible sin of the immigration to the United States. The Chafetz Chaim lived through the Great Immigration. He wrote books about the Great Immigration, and he decried the Great Immigration. He felt that it was a weakening traditional Jewish life, which it was. And he said he lists a whole bunch of reasons. One of them is the women. So they want more money. They heard that in America the streets are paved with gold. Their husbands can make money. They send them to America so that they'll send back money to them and eventually bring them to America also. So he was also anti-women voting, both in Poland and in Israel and in other places, and he signed proclamations along with many other rabbis against women voting or being elected to any public position. So in theory, he's going ahead and reflecting on what's happening. It's a big insight into history, in fact, to read that footnote of his, because he's describing what goes on in the world around him. And he says it used to be that they absorbed the Yiddishkeit and the Torah lifestyle from their parents' home. But today there's a lot of outside influences. And very often he describes how very often Jewish girls today do not reside in their parents' home altogether. And there's this distance, both culturally and physically, from their parents' home and lifestyle. And therefore, we're faced with a big problem. There's this abandoning of Jewish life. And therefore, we have to teach them Torah. We have to teach them Torah subjects and Sfarim, and he lists a whole bunch of Sfarim we should teach them. And in theory, it's a heter. He's writing it as there's no more of this, Isser. It's not really forbidden anymore. He even says that some of their study of Torah for women should now be considered a great mitzvah. Presumably, other learning is other Sfarim that he doesn't mention is either not a mitzvah and it's just permitted, or maybe it's still on the other prohibition, the previous prohibition. I don't know. And I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who have strong opinions about this. So I'm not going to state any. So, but that's what he says. So he says that therefore this prohibition no longer exists, at least in a limited context. Now, in that context, it's worth mentioning the changing role of women in what's happening at that time, not in the Hasidic world in general, but in the specific court of Chabad, Lubavitch. And for similar reasons, utilizing the women as a force of tradition against the sweeping changes of modernity. It starts a little bit by the Rashab, the fifth Rebbe, but much more by the Rayatz, the previous Rebbe, and then, of course, even more so by the last Rebbe. And this was not really about formal education. That wasn't the subject, although that came up much later. And it's more related to another very monumental question and topic in the history of the Hasidic movement, which is, are women considered Hasidim, or more correctly, Chasidais, as well, or are they just the husband of, daughter of, or from a family of Hasidim? And that's a different question for another time. And here they become more incorporated into the Hasidic court to become considered Hasidim on their own. In this, and then the last topic I want to explore at this stage is what's going on outside the traditional Jewish world, and how are Jewish girls being integrated into Jewish education outside the normal framework, or the traditional framework, the traditional framework of Jewish education. We have in the latter part of the 19th century a new type of school arises on the horizon. Last episode we focused a lot on Galicia, on Austria-Hungary, on the public school system, on the compulsory education law. In Russia, it comes in much later stages. But what does spring up from the grassroots is the Cheder Metukan, the fixed, or the upgraded, or the progressive, or whatever, how you want to translate it, Cheder. And that's, of course, influenced by the Haskalah movement, the Jewish Enlightenment in Russia. And it's also influenced by the Chovevei Zion, the Lovers of Zion movement in Russia at the end of the 19th century. And it's to improve the existing infrastructure of the Cheder, which was very in need of improvement. And pretty much everyone agreed that it was in need of improvement. The question is in which direction to improve it. And the Cheder Metukan had, it brought ideas of nationalism in, and Jewish nationalism, which was an idea on the rise and very prominent in the Chovevei Zion in the last decades of the 19th century. And it was a Jewish school, and it added different subjects, and it changed a lot of what was going on in the Cheder up until that point. Now, because it promulgated Jewish identity and nationalism, and it was Jewish schools, the Tsar and his government did not like it, and they were opposed to it, which caused them to a lot of problems. Why? Because they wanted them to integrate into Russian schools. They wanted them to attend Russian schools and not promote ideas of, God forbid, of Jewish nationalism and uniqueness and stuff like that. So the other ones who opposed them were the conservative elements within the traditional Jewish community. They did not like the new Cheders, and they saw it as a tool of the Haskalah of the Enlightenment, and of bringing secular studies and all kinds of other terrible changes into the Cheder system, into the traditional Jewish educational system. In fact, the old Ashkenazic pronunciation was still used then. The Cheder Metukan did not use modern Hebrew. And in fact, most of the Cheder Metukan still used Yiddish. The Hebrew schools only came a generation later. But even any Hebrew that they did use, it was still used with the old Ashkenazic pronunciation. So it was called the Cheder Metukan. So the opponents within the Jewish community said, it's a Cheder Metukan. It's not with a saf, it's a samach. It's a dangerous Cheder, and therefore you should never send your kids and your children to this type of Cheder. Among the many other changes they did in these schools, which is really a topic for another time, but one of them was that many of them had girls' programs, either co-ed, which was the real Cheder Metukans, or even separate, but they offered education for girls. So that means there's Jewish girls' education, not just last time we discussed the public schools. And here we're still in the end of the 19th century in Russia, in the Pale Settlement, in where it's the most traditional Jewish life. And to put things in perspective by how widespread this was, by 1903, that's the turn of the century, there's close to 1,000 Cheder Metukans in Russia. Not all of them had girls' programs, but many of them did. Now, if we go further, this is also during the time of the Great Immigration. The immigrants to the United States obviously sent their daughters to public school, their girls to public school. In part one, we discussed how most girls and boys in Austria-Hungary and Galicia and Hungary and those places went to public school as well. A generation later, the Cheder Metukan back in Russia, and that by now it's a generation later, it's after the World War I, so it's already Poland, it's the interwar period. There's the Jewish school systems, the Tarbut of the Zionists, there's the Tzisha of the Yiddishists, which was mainly the Bund, but also Poalei Zion small, the leftist Poalei Zion, and the Folks Party. The Yiddishist movements had the Tzisha school system, which also had thousands of students. Now those two, the Tarbut and the Bund, the Yiddishist schools, they were co-ed. So the girls went to school also, and that was mostly in the interwar period. So the girls are getting an education. They're getting a form of a Jewish education. It's completely secular. The Yiddishist schools were even anti-religious. The Tarbut schools, it's debatable. Also a topic for another time. But they're definitely irreligious. They're definitely secular. They were giving a different type of Jewish education, but it wasn't public school. So it was all these different options for girls already to attend schools. There was exclusively Jewish girls' schools. There was one of the more famous ones was the Yehudia School in Warsaw. It was for upper class families. It was rich, wealthy families sent their girls. There was Zionists, and it was an only girls' high school in Warsaw. This was like one of the most elite schools of high quality education. In fact, the one who taught Jewish history at the Yehudia School in the interwar period was none other than Dr. Emanuel Ringelblum, of the later famous of the Warsaw Ghetto and the Einik Shabbos archive. So that was one of his only steady sources of income. And it's hard to imagine the Yiddishist Poalei Zion, almost borderline Marxist Ringelblum teaching at a school that's such an exclusive, rich, for rich girls and Zionists. But that's how it works. That's when you need a parnasa. That's what you do. Either way, so there's also, I mentioned in part one, Catholic schools that are also only for girls, which sometimes Hasidic families would prefer to send their girls to, because at least they would be separate, only with girls. So at this point, we freeze the moment. In the early 1900s, we're talking about that in the non-Jewish world, public school education is common, and most Jews are sending their girls and very often their boys to public school. So girls are getting already a formal, institutionalized education. Within the Jewish world, we have all kinds of Jewish streams of education, the Cheder Metukan, and later on the Tarbut and the Bund and the Yiddishists, and even exclusively girls' schools, where the girls are getting a formal institutionalized education. We have a situation where, because of all the changes, because of everything going on, there are rabbis like the Chafetz Chaim who say that not only is it not forbidden any longer to teach Torah to girls, but it may be even a great mitzvah. And then we have, within the traditional Jewish world, by already half a century earlier and more, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, which had already spread in isolated places across Europe, not only in Frankfurt, that there was strictly Orthodox, strictly, good Torah education available for girls. If we take that all into context, we'll be able to understand how in the next stage, at this point, it's only the Eastern European religious Jews who are lagging behind. If we think about it, by the way, in general, in the modern era, the conservative elements within probably any society, but for sure in Jewish society, very often the certain ideas or programs that are opposed, it's just a matter of time before it's incorporated into the system, and that's the nature of things, and that's how it has gone throughout history. So it's just a familiar concept. So it's the same thing with this. It's just a matter of time. It's not a revolution that's completely out of the blue. It's just a matter of time because it's happening all around. And that will lead us, of course, into the next stage. But I just would like to end off with one last point, is that during World War I, the old-time Cheder system for boys and Jewish education for boys collapses. The entire Jewish educational infrastructure collapses as a result of World War I, as of the mayhem, as of the destruction, and the borders, the new republics that rise up. And the compromises to modernity are necessary after World War I just because it's a new reality. And that's as far as boys' education is concerned. And there's all of a sudden secular studies in boys' chadarim in the post-World War I world, in Poland and in Hasidic communities and all types of places with the backing of people like the Ger Rebbe. And so the modifications in boys' chinuch, which led to open the door also for similar things to happen to girls' education as well. So the stage is pretty much set. So that's part 2 of Sisters of the Revolution. And we'll continue, of course, with the next part in 2 weeks. So this is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, sponsorships, and lectures and tours. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.